Welcome to part 4 of the Aquila display cabinet. And so in this video we're going to be moving on to building our doors as well as doing the stained glass work that is going to be going inside of our doors. So up to this point in the previous videos we got the casework almost completely done. We have a few final touches to add to it, but for the most part it is completely put together. So now we can move on to putting together our doors. And so this is a part of the project that I was so looking forward to because while I was working the design for this project, I changed up my ideas a little bit and I wanted to try some new things, and I went through and basically completely changed up the style of the stained glass windows that I was going to do. I ended up getting some more inspiration from some new sources, and I was just so looking forward to getting around to doing this part of it. So we'll talk about that more when we get to the actual glass work, but to start us off here, you're going to notice some new tools are going to show up in the shop here. So one of the things that I've been thinking about lately is how I can speed up my workflow. Because since getting this new job, I don't have nearly as much time to get out into the shop. And little tasks that before I used to enjoy, like going through and cutting Morrison tenon, ended up taking a lot more time. So I decided to invest in a Festool domino, which I know a lot of people are probably dying inside seeing me use a Festool product of any kind, and it's one of those things where for me it just seemed like the right time to invest in something like this. So you're going to see it right now on this project, but you'll also see it a lot more going forward. And one of the things I have to say is that I did really enjoy being able to use the Festool domino. Now this is one of those parts that I was really excited to figure out on this project. I've had a lot of issues trying to cut the rabbets into my door frames in the past, and what I figured out on this project is if I started with a very large bearing on the top of my rabbeting bit, so I was basically cutting about 1/8 of an inch rabbet. Then I was able to size up or drop down the size of the bearing, whatever way you want to look at it, and was able to cut my rabbet to the full depth afterwards. And I was able to get these beautifully clean rabbets with absolutely no tear out. So that was a really nice lesson to learn on this project. Then the rest of the doors is very straightforward. I'm just going through and mounting in hinges the same way I always do. And this is one of those things that I've spent a lot of time figuring out my process for how to hang doors. And it's actually become fairly straightforward. Now one of the things I want to point out here is when you look at the hinge spacers when they're mounted on the cabinet, I have them set just a little bit ways back so there's some of that green painted surface still visible. And my idea with this is that I wanted you to be able to see kind of this green outline around both the doors and then the drawers when the cabinet is fully put together, because I really wanted to highlight the fact that the interior was painted. Since we know we were going to be able to see it through the glass windows that are going to be going in here anyway, I just thought it would be a nice little extra touch, and I just thought it would look good. And I have to say in the final piece, I do personally think it looks good. Again, this is one of those things where I would love to hear you guys' opinions about that. Do you think I should have made it so that the paint wasn't visible on the outside? But either way, now we get to discover another wonderful problem, and that is that I, for some reason, can't seem to get the sizing of my doors right. So luckily enough, this is a very easy fix. I just glued on some quarter sawn filler strips onto the sides of my doors, and all I have to do is just hand plane them down. Now this is one of those simple things in woodworking that you can either ruin a project or completely save it. And it all comes down to just thinking about things before you jump into it. Because I ran through a lot of different ideas of how I could potentially fix these weird gaps that I had in my doors, and honestly this was the easiest one. And so all I'm doing is just hand planing this strip down until it's barely visible and I get just the perfect gap between my doors. And of course this isn't the ideal solution. The ideal way to do this would be to get your sizing right the first time. But in this case, these little filler pieces that I put on here are not actually going to be visible in the final piece whatsoever. Because by the time we go through and put on the chamfers and do all kind of the final finishing work, they just blend in perfectly. And this is one of those things I really enjoy about my growth as a woodworker. When I first noticed I had this problem between my doors, the gap wasn't quite where I wanted it to be, I've thought of a whole bunch of different solutions. I could have remade my hinge spacers to just have a little bit extra thickness. I could glue on these strips to add a little bit more thickness to the inside of the doors, or I could have done some filler strips around all four sides of the door to kind of change up the visual look. All around, it was great because I just had all these different ideas for how I could solve this very simple problem that I had, and it really didn't become any bigger of an issue. So with our door frames completed, we can now move on to the stained glass. So like I said earlier, I was so excited to do this. So my original design for these windows, my plan for the original windows anyway, was to try out a new material. So for all the stained glass work that I've done, I've been working with zinc, and that's what we're going to be using in this project. But originally I'd wanted to do copper. The only downside to the copper is that I have to special order it from a place. And so what ended up happening is that when I was kind of doing some extra research about the stained glass work and that, I came across this very specific style of stained glass called the prairie style. And this style was put together by Frank Lloyd Wright, which is a name you guys might recognize because he is a very famous architect, and he has some of the most beautiful architecture skills that I've ever seen. This guy is just an amazing designer, and what I really liked about his style of stained glass is its very geometric patterns. You know, everything is based around straight lines, and in doing more research, I found out that the reason his style is kind of based off of these straight lines and is very much so what I like is because he used zinc cane as well. So the specific style of stained glass that he did is exactly what I'm trying to do right now. And so this worked perfectly for me because a lot of the problems I've ran into with the whole stained glass thing and trying to do it in the way that I am, because the problem is when you work with zinc, it's a lot more rigid compared to something like lead that you're typically supposed to use. So with that increased rigidity of the zinc, you kind of have to change up your designs. You don't have as much freedom to do things. And so this specific style, this prairie style of stained glass, is just exactly what I've always wanted to kind of go with. So I took one of his designs and kind of manipulated it and updated it to fit specifically with what I was doing on this cabinet. And this is by far my favorite set of stained glass windows I've put together so far. The overall design, the texture, the color, I really went kind of crazy with these windows and put in a ton of effort to really make them look very unique. And so we're going to be going through and using a few different types and colors of glass. So this first type of glass I'm using here is called artisan glass. And one of the things I noticed very quickly about it is that it really likes to kind of chip and crackle. And so you kind of saw it on that first piece I broke off there. It broke on that curve and wasn't super nice. But overall, this glass was pretty decent to work with. Now, this is going to be our light red glass, and this is going to be, again, a very important design choice when I was putting this thing together, is I wanted to have this very subtly contrasting glass pieces. So we have this chevron pattern going down the center of both windows, and I wanted, again, to have this very subtle contrast between our light red and dark red. And this proved almost impossible to do. When I went to the store to try and find a nice dark red stained glass, I searched for hours. I talked to the guy at the store, he couldn't find anything, and kind of out of accident, I pulled out this one sheet that was kind of shoved in the back, and it was just absolutely this perfect dark red. And what I had learned while working with specifically that dark red glass is that whatever the brand is, I think it's called German Antique, something to that extent, it is the best glass I have ever had the pleasure of working with. It cut so cleanly, it broke very nicely, you could shape it so perfectly. So the next time I go down to the stained glass store, I'm probably going to try and pick up as many pieces of that type of glass as I can. But for now, I was so excited that I could start to put together this pattern that I had in my mind, and that it was actually starting to come together. The other thing you're going to notice here is that I decided to use quite a bit of clear glass because, again, this is a display cabinet. We want to be able to see what's inside. But I also didn't want to just use clear glass. So I'm using a mixture of both perfectly clear glass as well as some textured water glass, I believe it's called. So it just has a little bit of a rippled texture on one side. And I think that this combination just worked, again, so perfectly because it helped kind of break up those larger portions and just kind of helped bring a little bit more visual interest into already very interesting windows. Now, one of the things I didn't think about with this design that I'd come up with is how much work it was going to be to fit up these pieces. This is, again, the most complex stained glass design I've done to date, and man, it took a long time. I just spent, I think, almost 4 days just sitting there grinding down these pieces, getting everything to fit nicely. And so what I'm doing right here is just kind of our initial fit up. So we're just kind of getting the pieces to fit into the shapes that I had printed out on the piece of paper. And then once they are all kind of fitting together nicely, then we can bring the zinc over and start actually fitting it into the zinc, which meant removing a little bit more material. And so that's the really nice thing about working with stained glass. One of the things I never really thought of before I got into actually doing this is that you can actually very easily adjust these pieces of glass. You know, when you think about a material like glass, you just instantly think that it's this super delicate material that, you know, can't be easily worked. But again, surprisingly enough, with the use of my one diamond stone as well as my little diamond grinder, I was very easily able to fit up all of these pieces. Now, again, as my skills get better with my stained glass work, I'm hoping that I can do less grinding, less kind of shaping of these pieces afterwards, and kind of in the raw cutting part, I can also get a little bit better. And then moving on to the soldering. Now, this is an area where I did make quite a few bad mistakes. Now, with all the different windows I've done, I've gotten a decent amount of practice with soldering, and one of the hardest things I've found is just kind of getting a nice consistent flow between all your different joints, because sometimes I'll have a joint that comes together just really nicely, and other times I'll have ones that just go absolutely horrible. And so one of the tricks that I tried out on this project was taking a little bit of 180 grit sandpaper afterwards and smoothing out my solder joints. And I think someone mentioned this to me in the comments of one of my previous videos, and I thought it was crazy. You know, I didn't want to take sandpaper anywhere near the glass, but on this one, I decided to give it a shot, and I'm actually very happy to say that it worked out great. Now, it didn't make my solder joints look absolutely perfect, but it just helped smooth out some of the ones that looked a little bit shoddy. And overall, once we go through and blacken the whole frame, they did look a lot better. So it really was just a case of trying to learn and find new techniques that are going to help make up for my lack of skill at this point in time. And again, this is also just a whole learning opportunity. Every time I do one of these stained glass windows, I find that my skills just keep getting better. And the hardest part for me is where I'm at with woodworking is very different from where I'm at with my stained glass work. So, well, with this, you know, with the Aquila display cabinet, I think that the whole woodworking part of it came out absolutely beautifully. These windows, I would say, are, you know, not as good or not up to the same level, but they still work together. And that's one of those things that I'm very excited for the day when my ability to make these stained glass windows is just as good as my ability to do woodworking. So right now, I'm very much so a novice when it comes to stained glass work, but I think it's going to get a lot better in the future. And then as kind of a final learning opportunity or trial on these windows, I decided to go through and actually hand paint all of the zinc. So I started by blackening it with the chemicals, which doesn't really work very well with the zinc. But then going through was just some matte black paint. I just went and painted everything. And this took hours, but was well worth it. And you guys will see this in the final piece, but I think you'll agree it was well worth the effort to paint all this by hand. So as always guys, I do hope you enjoyed this video, and I will see you in the next one.